I want to thank a demented member of our audience for sending me a companion story to something after I posted it yesterday at Facebook, which is, you may have heard of that. That's a service online that people use to, silence conservative views. 7 minutes after 9 o'clock. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com, 56. There was a story out just a couple of weeks ago that said Facebook, after the controversy about its censorship of conservative news outlets, has decided then overall to just downplay its news feed and will return to just showing pictures of, your vacations and cat videos because they don't want to be involved in all this controversy. And if they have to actually give a balanced view of the world, well, the people who run that company would rather not do that. So I posted a story that I knew would get their approval because it comes from the liberal Pravda-on-the-Potomac, sometimes known as the Washington Post, and this is from the Wonk blog. And the title is Meat is Horrible. Rachel Premack, the writer, well, you can tell she was standing at the back of the line when they were handing out last names. She says it may be delicious, but the evidence is accumulating that meat, in particular red meat, is just a disaster for the environment and not so great for human beings, too. I wish she had mentioned this before I went to lunch yesterday and had a great big hamburger with French fries. By 2050, scientists forecast that emissions from agriculture alone will account for how much carbon dioxide the world can use to avoid catastrophic global warming. It already accounts for 1/3 of emissions today, and half of that comes from livestock. Who knew that belching and breaking wind could be so incredibly dangerous? Agriculture consumes 80% of water in the United States. I tend to believe that figure might be a little bit high because I drink about a gallon a day myself. But even if it does, well, that's 80% that would otherwise just be sort of sitting around. And you know what? Most livestock, if you ever were around a farm, most livestock does a pretty good job of getting rid of whatever it drinks. and even if you're using it for almonds or oranges or corn or soybeans, you know what? It all gets absorbed back up into the atmosphere and then falls back down as rain. But I don't like to mention these scientific facts over at Pravda-on-the-Potomac. And then she says, these two charts show that meat is in particular thirsty. For a kilogram, that's 2.2 pounds, by the way, of red meat, you need considerably more water than for plant products. Doo-doo, doo-doo, doo-doo. Oh, terrible. The Danish government is considering a recommendation from its ethics council that all red meat should be taxed. They already tax everything in Denmark as it is. This is all because they want to provide a few more social programs that they can no longer afford. Do you realize if you want to buy a car in Denmark, you can't buy a big car, you got to buy a small car. So let's say you want to buy, I don't know, a $22,000 automobile, one of these little compact things that you have to basically have a shoehorn to get into. By the time you end up paying all of the taxes on that automobile that they add, the value-added taxes and the like, I know this because a friend of mine used to do business over there. And he told me this story just a couple of weeks ago. Denny, if you're listening this morning, thank you. But that car, by the time you end up buying it, will be over $40,000. So why would you bother to buy a little tiny postage stamp size car for $22,000 if you're going to be paying double that? Plus, you'll then pay about $8 in gasoline per gallon so they can continue to fund all of the big social programs they have. And we should point out, Denmark is a really tiny country. The reason all the cars are small is because there's nowhere to drive them. This is a country about the size of, I don't know, not even as big as probably New Jersey. For crying out loud, people talk about, in Europe they have the wonderful transportation systems and they have buses and subways and trains. Yeah, but they're only driving from like here to Burley and back. I mean, that's it. They don't have to drive from coast to coast like we do sometimes. So I'm looking at that story, and I posted it to Facebook to get a little comment. And as I say, a demented member of our audience, thank you, Martin, followed it up by posting this from the Wall Street Journal, which is generally nowhere near as liberal as Pravda-on-the-Potomac, although content analysis of the Wall Street Journal done 10 years ago said, as it turns out, its news pages are among the most liberal in the country, but its op-ed pages actually are not. And this is an essay from the op-ed pages, and it's from a woman named Nicolette Hahn Niemann, and she is a vegetarian. You know, I don't mind a few of those alfalfa sprouts. Throw them on my salad once in a while. along, with the bacon bits and the blue cheese dressing and a couple of olives, it's fine. But all of these people that brag about being vegetarians and coming up with that, telling you, oh, we could make burgers instead from the protein of the alfalfa sprout and it'll taste just the same. Yeah, as long as you smear it in ketchup. But she says people who advocate eating less beef often argue that producing it hurts the environment. Cattle, we are told, have an outsized ecological footprint. They guzzle water, trample plants and soils, and consume precious grains that should be nourishing hungry humans. Lately, critics have blamed bovine burps, flatulence, and even breath for climate change. Well, I know a few farmers that I used to visit years ago, and I do admit that sometimes the cattle have bad breath. But frankly, you can't imagine some of the people that I've worked with over the years. And in a business where we're paid to talk, that gets a little bit difficult to take from time to time. But nobody's complaining about them. She goes on to say that all of U.S. agriculture accounts for just 8% of our greenhouse emissions. Well, this is quite a contrast to what you're reading over at Pravda-on-the-Potomac. So which one would be right? Methane from cattle can be mitigated in several ways. Australian research shows that certain nutritional supplements can cut methane from cattle by half. Well, okay, so my dad told me stories, by the way, about a couple of guys from Arkansas that he served in the Army with. And he said they had an ability to take care of their own methane emissions. He said they thought it was funny to take a lighter. Well, enough said. It's amazing that they didn't burn themselves. At the same time, cattle are key to the world's most promising strategy, she writes, to counter global warming, restoring carbon to the soil. 1/10 of all human-caused carbon emissions since 1850 have come from soil, according to ecologist Richard Houghton of the Woods Hole Research Center. This is due to tillage. Now, plant-covered land that is never plowed is ideal for recapturing carbon through photosynthesis and for holding it in stable forms. Most of the world's beef cattle are raised on grass. Their pruning mouths stimulate vegetative growth as their trampling hooves and their digestive tracts foster seed germination and nutrient recycling. Now, she goes on for another full page with all of this, but she's really refuting all of these people out there who say that it's the end of the world because there are cattle out there. You realize that before a great deal of Caucasians got to this part of the country, the American West was covered in something called the bison. And the bison was belching and pooping and flatulent all over the American West. There's no alarm about that. Apparently that worked out just fine. And then there were a lot less of them. And then everyone says, oh, ecological disaster. How horrible is this? Well, apparently they were among the biggest farters on the planet, for all we know. 9:14, Bill Colley with you on Top Story this morning on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com, 736-0300, 736-0300. Again, you have the United Nations and all of its, remember the movie Miracle on 34th Street? Remember the psychologist, the nervous little guy? Well, he got a job over at the United Nations, and he doesn't want you eating meat. And he's got a pipeline over to the Washington Post. This is what this is all about. You're up next. You're on KLIX.
Hey, Bill, I'd like to know what the stats are on all this. Because, us guys with cattle, I've got 80 heads in the back of my truck right now. We grow stuff to feed them, which provides oxygen. And then we feed the cattle. All the cattle places, how much emissions they put out compared to New York?
Oh. Yeah, and emissions coming out of Washington. I thank you much for the telephone call. 736-0300, 736-0300. Here's a little thing, too. They tell you all the time about the emissions from automobiles. And, the internal combustion engine was one of the great harmful aspects of the 20th century to planet Earth. No. Think about this for a minute. You think about a place like New York City. Do you realize before they actually had people driving around in trucks and cars and buses and the like, they had horses? Do you know that the horses who were going through the streets of New York were leaving a byproduct? I went to the parade over the weekend in Kimberly, and I was at the parade the weekend before in Buell, and I do know that horses leave behind byproducts. It's a little difficult sometimes to cross the street after the parade, if you know what I mean. So if you have a city of several million people and everything's being dragged around the city by horse cart, you realize that it isn't long before the city streets are nothing but a great big mat. And I say mat because I remember I used to have to clean out horse stalls when I was a kid. And sometimes you'd get in there and somebody hadn't been in there in a while, and there would be this mat, and I'd have to use a pitchfork. And that mat is held together by hay, which is also part of the byproduct, which isn't all digested, and it's messy and it's nasty, and I ruined my shoes, and I didn't have any Wellingtons, and oh, it was awful. But those streets of places like New York and San Francisco and Seattle and Chicago and Boston and Baltimore, and they were all filled with dung. Now, do you think that was any better for the human beings at the time than, let's say, somebody driving an automobile through town? See, the environmentalists never like to tell you about the other side, the flip of the coin on all of this. Their recommendation would be, well, if there were fewer people, there would be fewer horses leaving dung behind. How do you propose that we get to fewer people? Well, if we aborted more babies and sterilized more people and then just got rid of a lot of useless eaters, are you proposing then eliminating yourself? Well, no. Being the smartest person in the room, I have to stay behind and ensure that this is all done right. That's what they're telling you. Speaking of the environment and speaking of the world and the direction the planet is going, I didn't get to it last week because we had so many big events popping up, but I saw two stories that both suggested we are moving away from this period of global warming that we've been told about for the last 25 years that's killing us all and going to be the end of humanity and civilization, and that the world is going to be fried to a crisp. And instead, it looks like we are headed toward a much cooler period. Now, back in the late 1990s, I was reading a cover story in Atlantic, and the writer was suggesting that something called the Atlantic Conveyor could suddenly shut down and has shut down numerous times throughout world history. And the Atlantic Conveyor shuts down on a natural cycle. What happens is the Earth warms, and all of a sudden there's an inversion somewhere eventually in the ocean, and then the water stops running just because it heats up to a point where all of a sudden it's just not moving like it used to. And when that happens, things get really, really cold, and they get cold in a matter of a few years. And then we get very cold winters and maybe even ice ages. Now, that was in the 1990s, and this guy said at the time, this writer, he said, this could be far worse than any notions we have of global warming, because the world gets warmer, you can still grow things, and you can always just take a few clothes off. But the world gets really, really cold, all of a sudden it's tough to stay alive, and you can't grow things. So indeed, we may actually be heading more toward that than any worries about a warm planet. And frankly, that worries me a lot more than, beachfront property maybe being lost in a couple of places outside of Miami and Fort Lauderdale, because those people can afford to lose it. They'll just throw a few more million into something a little closer to inland. They'll recede with the beach. The rest of us, we don't have that choice. 20 minutes after 9 o'clock, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and NewsRadio1310.com. We talked about the possibility of Mike Crapo as a VP candidate in the last half hour. More details on that coming up.